The drug cartel didn't lose their submarine because the Coast Guard was smarter. They lost it because they were too successful. The story of how one organization became so effective at moving cocaine across impossible distances, only to collapse under the weight of its own logistics, reveals something the official reports never explain. Sometimes hiding in plain sight kills you faster than being found. Everyone knows about narco submarines by now. Low profile fiberglass tubes, massive carrying capacity, nearly invisible to radar. The engineering is crude but effective, which is exactly the problem nobody talks about. Because here's what the detention reports don't mention. The cartels didn't get caught because their submarines were too visible. They got caught because building, maintaining, operating these vessels created a paper trail so massive, so complicated, that it required an entire shadow economy just to keep them afloat. Think about it. A semi-submersible doesn't build itself. Someone has to fabricate the fiberglass, someone has to source the diesel engine, someone has to weld the ballast tanks, someone has to test the pressure hulls, someone has to navigate the vessel through thousands of miles of open ocean without hitting a rock or sinking. Every single one of those someones. From the welder in the Colombian jungle factory to the GPS operator guiding the vessel through the night. Leaves a trace, a phone record, a bank transfer, a supply purchase, a refueling stop. The US Coast Guard didn't catch this particular submarine because they spotted it on radar. Caught it because they spent 18 months untangling the logistical web that had to exist for the submarine to operate at all. That's the story the media never tells you, because it's not about high-speed boat chases or dramatic deckboarding operations. It's about how modern criminal organizations fail not because enforcement agencies are tactical geniuses, but because scale betrays secrecy. Here's the reality. Narco submarines work when they're rare. When maybe one or two leave the Colombian coast per year, the cartel can maintain absolute compartmentalization. The builder doesn't know the navigator doesn't know the owner doesn't know the final destination. Plausible deniability stacked on top of plausible deniability. But during the early 2000s, something changed. The cartels got greedy, production increased, demand increased, and suddenly, instead of operating one or two submarines per season, they were trying to move 4, 5, sometimes 6 vessels across the Pacific simultaneously. That's when the optimization nightmare began. Because when you move also multiple vessels, you can't afford to have each one operating independently. It would be inefficient. So you centralize, you create communication networks, you establish refueling supply chains, you develop standardized procedures, you hire more people, you create more touch points. Every single optimization designed to make the operation more efficient also makes it more visible to intelligence analysis. The June 2019 interdiction, the one everyone remembers because of the spectacular Coast Guard boarding, didn't happen because one vessel was spotted by radar. It happened because the entire operational network surrounding that vessel had been mapped. The DEA had already identified the supply chain. They already knew which mechanics in Ecuador were servicing the engines. They already understood the fuel distribution logistics. They already had the communication intercepts. And they were simply waiting for the right moment to act. This is where the conventional narrative collapses. The Coast Guard doesn't have some magical radar that pierces through ocean water and identifies submarines. That's not how maritime enforcement works in 2024. Instead, they have something far more powerful. They have visibility into the logistical infrastructure that supports criminal maritime operations. They understand the fuel supply chains. They monitor the shipyards, they track the personnel movements, they intercept the communications. The submarine itself is almost irrelevant. It's the support network that makes the actual interception possible. The cartel that built this particular vessel made a critical mistake. They scaled production without scaling security. They tried to move from artisanal submarine smuggling, where each voyage was a carefully orchestrated event requiring months of preparation, to industrial-scale maritime trafficking. And in doing that, they created organizational complexity that no amount of compartmentalization could adequately hide. Consider the coordination required to move a 40-foot fiberglass vessel 2.00 miles across open ocean without getting spotted. The submarine needs fuel. The submarine needs navigators who understand GPS and oceanography. The submarine needs a launch coordination team that knows tidal patterns. The submarine needs a reception team at the destination point. The submarine needs security, people protecting it from being stolen by rival cartels. The submarine needs logistics, someone planning the route to avoid naval choke points. And all of those people have families. All of those people need to be paid. All of those people create communication records. The Coast Guard wasn't trying to find a submarine. They were trying to find the people who couldn't hide. The mechanics, the fuel suppliers, the navigation coordinators, the reception teams, the financial handlers who moved millions to pay for the operation. Once you understand the network, the submarine becomes easy to intercept. You're not looking for a needle in an ocean haystack. You're following a supply line that leads directly to the needle. The Sinaloa Cartel, one of the largest cocaine trafficking organizations in the world, demonstrated extraordinary innovation when they developed this narco submarine capability. They solved a genuinely difficult engineering problem, created vessels that could move massive quantities of product across distances where conventional boats would be intercepted. But they failed to solve the organizational problem. They couldn't figure out how to scale the operation while maintaining the compartmentalization necessary for operational security. What happened in June 2019 wasn't a breakthrough in maritime surveillance. It was the inevitable result of a criminal organization becoming too ambitious. They built better submarines. They built more submarines. In doing that, they created a logistical footprint so large that even a partially competent law enforcement agency could map it. The intelligence advantage the United States possesses isn't technological omniscience. It's not some secret sensor system that can see through water or detect submarines from space. The advantage is the ability to understand criminal supply chains at scale, the ability to identify the people, facilities, infrastructure required to make smuggling operations viable, the ability to recognize when a criminal organization transitions from clandestine to industrial. Here's the counterintuitive truth. The most sophisticated narco submarines, the ones that succeed, aren't the ones with the best engineering. They're the ones that maintain the smallest support footprint, the one-off operations, the ad hoc networks, the operational structures where knowledge is distributed in a way that makes prosecution impossible. The submarines that get caught are often the ones that work too well, because success breeds expansion, and expansion creates visibility. This is actually available in much deeper detail in the description and in the pinned comment if you want to understand how intelligence agencies actually track smuggling networks. It's far more sophisticated than people realize. The 6 operators aboard this specific vessel thought they had achieved something remarkable. They had built and launched a vessel that had successfully moved contraband across vast distances. They had beaten the surveillance systems. They had avoided detection. They had proven that the cartel's investment in submarine technology was paying dividends. They were halfway across the Pacific, well into what should have been a routine 10-knot transit to the destination point, when the decision was made somewhere in Washington, D.C. to move forward with the interdiction. Spectacular Coast Guard boarding. The part that made it into the news cycle, the part where armed personnel leaped between moving vessels while the submarine crew attempted to sink their own ship. That was theatre. It was the final act of a play that had already been written months earlier. The real operation happened in intelligence centers. It happened in supply chain analysis. It happened in the mapping of logistics networks. It happened in the identification of the people who couldn't hide. What made this interdiction significant wasn't the tactical skill involved in boarding a moving submarine. What made it significant was what it revealed about how the cartels had evolved. They had moved beyond innovation and into expansion. They had created an operation so large, so logistically complex, it could be detected by following the infrastructure rather than finding the vessel. Once you understand that principle, that criminal organizations fail when they scale beyond their capacity to maintain compartmentalization. Start to see it everywhere. In the weapons trafficking networks in Eastern Europe, in the human trafficking organizations operating across the Sahara, shadow financial systems supporting sanctions evasion. Scale is the enemy of secrecy, always. The more successful the operation becomes, the more people it requires. And the more people it requires, the more vulnerable it becomes to detection. The DEA and the Coast Guard executed a textbook interdiction because they understood something fundamental about criminal maritime logistics. The submarines are just the visible manifestation of a much larger system. And once you understand the system, you don't hunt for submarines. You hunt for the network that makes submarines possible. This is exactly the kind of tactical and strategic insight that gets missed in the headlines. If you want to go deeper into how these detection networks actually work, how intelligence agencies track smuggling organizations, there's a comprehensive breakdown available in the description and the pinned comment. The methodology is genuinely fascinating. It applies far beyond maritime trafficking. The question that nobody asks is this: how much longer can the cartels continue to innovate their way out of enforcement if the fundamental problem isn't the technology, but the human infrastructure required to make the technology viable? Semi-submersibles were revolutionary in 2005. They're becoming obsolete, not because better detection systems exist, but because the organizations operating them can't hide the supply chains necessary to build and support them. The next evolution will probably be even more autonomous. Submarines with AI navigation. Submarines with pre-programmed routes that don't require onboard crew. Submarines that can be launched, pointed toward a destination, operated remotely from a distance. Because the cartel leadership understands the same principle the DEA understands. People are the vulnerability. The infrastructure is the vulnerability. The support network is the vulnerability. But when you remove the human element, you create a different problem. How do you maintain command and control over an expensive asset if it's completely autonomous? How do you navigate around unexpected obstacles? How do you respond to detection? How do you retrieve the vessel if something goes wrong? Autonomy solves the security problem, but creates a control problem. Control problems create their own vulnerabilities. This is the cycle that defines modern smuggling innovation. Every solution to an enforcement problem creates a new organizational complexity. Every organizational complexity creates new surfaces for detection. The submarines don't fail because they're not stealthy enough. They fail because the organizations operating them eventually become too large, too complicated, too visible to hide effectively. They're there. Part 1 complete. Awaiting Part 2 instructions. Satellite view ocean, waves patterns, maritime tracking. So the cartels know this. They've known it for years. It's precisely why they're building submarines in the first place. It's not about outrunning the Navy or outsmarting radar operators. It's about operating in a domain where conventional detection systems simply aren't designed to work. Submarine cabin interior, tight spaces. Operators think about what a radar system actually sees. It's designed to detect metal. Lots of metal moving through predictable airspace. Fighter jets, missiles. Large cargo ships with steel hulls that reflect radio waves like mirrors. Fiberglass doesn't do that. Fiberglass absorbs those signals. The radar pulse hits the sub, bounces uselessly, and the operator back on shore sees nothing but water noise. Submarine cross-section, underwater vessel, fiberglass. But here's what makes this even more elegant from the smuggler's perspective. Semi-submersibles don't need to be fast. Speed is what gets you caught. Speed creates wake patterns that high-altitude surveillance can track. Speed requires constant fuel consumption and raises the risk of engine malfunction. The cartels learned this lesson over decades. They watched speedboats get intercepted. They watched fast narco traffickers get spotted by aircraft. So they pivoted, built submarines that move at walking pace. Sometimes slower. Thermal imaging, aircraft view, heat signature. A vessel doing 8 to 10 knots through the Eastern Pacific takes weeks to reach its destination. But it arrives quietly. It doesn't advertise its presence through acoustic signatures that passive sonar can pick up. It doesn't disturb the water enough for modern maritime surveillance algorithms to flag it as anomalous. And critically, it doesn't consume fuel rapidly enough to require frequent resupply runs that might expose the logistics network. Military Operations Center, radar screens, soldiers monitoring. This is where the actual cat and mouse game gets interesting, because the Coast Guard knows all of this. They understand the physics, they understand the material science, they've captured enough narco subs to reverse engineer their design principles. But knowledge and capability are two different things. The Eastern Pacific Ocean covers roughly 1.5 million square miles. It's larger than the entire United States landmass. The Coast Guard doesn't have enough assets to maintain continuous coverage over that territory. cutters, helicopters, and surveillance aircraft. But you can't be everywhere at once. You have to make choices about where to allocate resources. And the cartels understand resource allocation better than most military strategists. Coast Guard vessel, ocean waves, maritime patrol, so they route their shipments through zones that are statistically undermonitored. They use intelligence networks, corrupted port officials, paid informants, cartel members with relatives in maritime law enforcement to identify patrol patterns. They learn when cutters rotate through maintenance cycles. They identify gaps in coverage, and they exploit those gaps with mathematical precision. This is the real game, not the submarines themselves, the organizational intelligence that surrounds them. Radar screen, detection, military equipment. In June of 2019, one of those organizational systems broke down. A high-altitude surveillance aircraft, likely a P-3 Orion operating out of Ecuador or one of the Central American bases, spotted something unusual. The submarine itself, the submarines are invisible, but the wake. The disturbance pattern left by the displacement of water and the vessel's movement. Wake detection is one of the few tools that works against semi-submersibles, because you're not trying to find the object. You're trying to find what it does to the environment around it. And that detection method has a critical flaw. It only works if the object is actually moving through an area where someone is looking. You have to get lucky. Or you have to have intelligence that puts you in the right location at the right time. Water displacement, wave pattern, detection diagram. The aircraft detected the wake. The data got relayed to operational centers. And within hours, Coast Guard cutter operating in the region was redirected to investigate. The crew didn't have a visual on the submarine yet. They only had coordinates. They only had suspicion. But the mathematical probability was high enough that this was worth pursuing. Coast Guard cutter, ocean pursuit, maritime chase. What happened next became the stuff of operational legend within Coast Guard circles. When the cutter approached the location, the submarine's crew realized they were about to be intercepted. They made a decision. They decided to scuttle the vessel, to intentionally sink it, destroying the cargo and eliminating the evidence that could be used to prosecute them. The US Navy, the Coast Guard, and various federal agencies maintain standing orders in these situations. If a vessel is about to be sunk, if there's cargo that's about to be destroyed, you attempt to board it. By any means necessary, and that's what happened. Military personnel, tactical gear, action sequence, a Coast Guard boarding team made the decision to attempt what amounted to an emergency intercept. The submarine was partially submerged, mostly invisible, moving through the water at low speed. The boarding team needed to cross several hundred meters of open ocean in their inflatable pursuit boat, approach the submarine's exposed air intake and cockpit section, and physically board it while the crew inside was actively trying to sink the vessel. The math was brutal. The submarine's crew, if they managed to close the internal valves and flood the compartments, could sink the vessel in minutes. The boarding team, traveling across open water in a small boat, faced multiple variables that could slow them down. Rough seas, distance, the submarine's defensive maneuvers, or simple human error. Boat perspective, pursuit. Target ahead, one operator made the decision to do something that had virtually no margin for error. He positioned the pursuit boat alongside the submarine's hull. He timed the wave motion, and he jumped. He jumped from a moving boat onto the slippery fiberglass hull of a semi-submerged submarine moving through the Pacific Ocean. One misstep meant falling into the water. One miscalculation meant being swept under the vessel, or caught between the boat and the submarine as they continued moving. And even if he made the jump, he had maybe 90 seconds, possibly less, to pry open the submarine's hatch before the crew inside, sealed it permanently and began flooding the compartments. Person jumping, ocean water, extreme action he made it. He landed on the hull. He maintained his balance on the slippery fiberglass, despite the motion of the water and the submarine beneath his feet. And he ran to the hatch. He reached it before the crew inside could complete the scuttling sequence. He forced it open using leverage, force, pure operational instinct, and he blocked the internal valves from being closed. Within minutes, backup arrived. More boarding personnel secured the submarine. They prevented the crew from destroying the vessel, and they recovered the cargo, 17,000 pounds of cocaine, worth somewhere between $200 million and $300 million at street value. Military vessels, Ocean captured vessel.
This was a tactical victory, absolutely. One of the most significant cocaine seizures in US maritime history.
The kind of operation that gets briefed to Congress. The kind of operation that generates headlines and press releases. From an organizational perspective, from the perspective of understanding how the smuggling networks actually function, this was a different kind of victory. This was intelligence gathering. This was a chance to reverse engineer the submarine, to understand its construction, its communications systems, its navigation capabilities, and critically, to identify how it fit into the larger trafficking organization. Submarine examination, technical inspection, evidence, and that's where the breakdown in the cartel's operation became visible. The submarine's crew included 4 individuals. They had to be identified, they had to be processed, and eventually, they had to be connected to the larger organization. Their communications had to be traced, their supply networks had to be mapped, decision-making hierarchy had to be understood. 3 of the crew members eventually faced federal charges. One was identified as a professional submarine operator, someone who had built his career flying these vessels, which meant he had connections to other crews, other operations, other transport chains. Following that one individual's network backward and forward created visibility into the organization's operations across multiple interdiction events. Courtroom, legal proceeding, prosecution, that's the vulnerability that submarines create, even when they're phenomenally stealthy. The moment they get caught, and eventually most do, the human beings operating them become intelligence sources. Voluntarily or not, connections become visible. Their methods become understood. And the entire organizational structure starts to unravel. The cartel that built that particular submarine did what most organizations do when one of their operations gets compromised. They adapted, changed routes, they changed personnel, they changed construction methods, they built new submarines with slight design modifications. They implemented new operational security protocols. But they couldn't change the fundamental problem. Humans operate these networks. Humans are inherently detectable. End of part 2. Satellite map, ocean shipping, strategic waters. By the time the particular cartel cell understood their submarine was compromised, the intelligence infrastructure they'd built over years was already being dismantled. Not just the vessel itself, the entire ecosystem supporting it. The safe houses, the fuel depots, the communications networks, the money trails leading back to distribution hubs in Central America. This is what most people don't understand about narco submarine operations. They're not isolated incidents. Each captured sub represents a single node in a massive network, and capturing one node reveals the connectivity of dozens of others. Network analysis, data connections, intelligence within weeks of the seizure. Coast Guard intelligence teams had connected this particular submarine to at least 7 other known cartel construction sites. They identified the fiberglass supplier. They traced the diesel engine procurement back to a legitimate maritime equipment dealer in Ecuador who'd been unknowingly facilitating cartel acquisitions for 3 years. They mapped the communication frequencies the crews used and began monitoring similar transmissions across the region. But here's where the tactical picture becomes more complicated than a simple law enforcement victory. While this particular submarine was disabled and its cargo seized, the cartel's operational response revealed something crucial. They weren't going to stop building these vessels. They were going to accelerate production. Jungle camp, hidden workshop, night operations. What happened in the months following this capture is a masterclass in adaptive criminal engineering. The cartels didn't just build replacement submarines. They built them better. They learned from this capture in ways that military planners frankly weren't prepared for. First, they reduced the profile even further. The new generation of narco subs featured a cockpit design that could retract fully below the waterline when the vessel was in high-risk zones. This meant the submarine could travel for hours completely submerged, with only a thin periscope-style snorkel extending above the surface. The snorkel was no thicker than a broomstick, and painted to match the colour of the water itself. Engineering blueprint, technical drawing, submarine design second, they modified their operational doctrine. Rather than single vessel runs across the open ocean, began deploying submarines in coordinated convoys. 3 submarines travelling together, spaced miles apart, with support vessels positioned at strategic intervals. If one got detected, the others could scatter in different directions, forcing the Coast Guard to choose which target to pursue. In a resource-constrained environment where the Coast Guard was already operating at maximum capacity, this meant at least two-thirds of these convoy operations would succeed. Third, and this is the tactical innovation that really concerned military planners. They began coordinating submarine movements with larger commercial shipping activity. The Pacific hurricane season generates millions of tons of commercial traffic, rerouting around storm systems. The cartels started timing their submarine deployments to coincide with these routing changes, using the confusion and the sheer volume of maritime traffic as cover. Container ships, ocean traffic, commercial shipping by 2020, just 1 year after this particular capture, Coast Guard interdiction rates for narco submarines had dropped from 11% to just under 7%. The submarines were faster, they were stealthier, they were operating in coordinated formations. And crucially, the cartels were distributing construction across multiple sites, making it impossible to dismantle the entire infrastructure through a single intelligence operation. But there's another layer to this that extends beyond the submarine operations themselves. The cartels understood that the real vulnerability wasn't the submarines. It was the destination logistics. They could move 50 kilograms of cocaine across the ocean undetected, but it got intercepted at a port facility or during a land-based transfer, the entire operation still failed. Shipping port, cargo containers, night loading. So they began investing in portside corruption on an unprecedented scale. Not just bribing individual customs officials. Every law enforcement agency already assumes some level of individual corruption, but actually purchasing legitimate businesses at major port facilities, container shipping companies, logistics firms, even a few small maritime insurance brokers. This created a legal veneer for their operations. A submarine could deliver its cargo to an intermediary vessel that was technically registered as a legitimate commercial shipping company. The cargo would be transferred using legitimate port infrastructure with legitimate paperwork, processed by what appeared to be legitimate employees. From a law enforcement perspective, this created a nearly impossible situation. You can intercept submarines, you can stop illegal vessels, but stopping a containerized cargo that appears legitimate on every document, moving through official port infrastructure, operated by what appears to be a legitimate company, that requires warrants, requires probable cause, that requires lawyers and judges and due process, legal documents, court files. Justice system, the cartels had essentially transformed their smuggling operation from a purely covert military-style operation into a hybrid that blurred the lines between legitimate commerce and illegal narcotics trafficking. They could operate in the open precisely because they'd learned how to make their operations look legitimate. This is where the captured submarine's long-term strategic impact becomes visible. Yes, it prevented the delivery of roughly $250 million in cocaine. Yes, damaged the specific cartel cell's operational capacity for several months. But the broader lesson it taught the organized crime infrastructure was this. If you want to survive sustained law enforcement pressure, you can't just optimize your tactical approach. You have to change your entire operational model. Organize crime, planning, strategy within 18 months of that spectacular Coast Guard boarding operation. The major cartels operating in the Pacific had begun a strategic shift. They were still building submarines. Construction actually increased, with an estimated 37 new vessels under construction across Colombian, Ecuadorian, and Peruvian shipyards. But they were integrating those submarines into a much larger logistics ecosystem. The submarines were no longer the primary smuggling method. They'd become one tool among many, an option to use when other routes were compromised, but not the default strategy anymore. The cartels were investing heavily in semi-submersible surface vessels, boats that looked like cargo vessels but were actually designed to carry drugs, partially submerged, making them harder to detect through aerial reconnaissance. They were expanding their use of commercial fishing vessels, especially in regions where the sheer volume of fishing traffic made individual vessel monitoring nearly impossible. Fishing boats, ocean vessels, maritime traffic. Most importantly, they were moving distribution methods away from ocean-based transport entirely. The cartels began shifting toward underground pipeline networks in Central America, actual physical pipes, sometimes running for 50 kilometers, carrying liquid cocaine dissolved in fuel products. They began investing in air transport through private aviation networks across the Caribbean and Central America. They began establishing distribution hubs in West Africa, using local smuggling networks and corrupt officials to move product through that continent and into Europe through ports less heavily monitored than those in North America. The captured submarine, in other words, became a forcing function. It didn't stop the cartels. It changed how they operated. In many ways, the new operational model proved more resilient than the old one. Pipeline routes, aircraft hangar, African ports, this is a pattern that repeats constantly in asymmetric warfare contexts. A military or law enforcement operation succeeds tactically, wins significant victories, captures or destroys assets worth millions or billions of dollars. But the adaptive response from the opposing force is to develop new methods, new vulnerabilities, new approaches that are actually harder to counter than the original strategy. The United States military learned this lesson painfully in Iraq and Afghanistan, where defeating a conventional military force through superior firepower only triggered the development of improvised explosive devices and insurgent networks that proved far more difficult to eliminate. The Coast Guard learned it with narco submarines. Success in shutting down one operational model led directly to the development of a more distributed, more integrated, ultimately more resilient smuggling infrastructure. Military patrol, bomb disposal, desert warfare. The fundamental problem that law enforcement and military forces face is this. They're trying to defend a vast, complex system, whether that's a coastline, a border, or an entire supply chain, against an adversary that only needs to find one successful pathway. The defender has to protect everywhere. The attacker only needs to succeed once. When you add the profit incentive of the global narcotics trade, estimated at over $430 billion annually, you're paying criminal organizations to innovate faster than government agencies can adapt. Every successful interdiction becomes a learning opportunity. Every captured asset becomes a blueprint for improvement. Every law enforcement victory sows the seeds of a future tactical defeat. What makes this particularly challenging from a strategic perspective is that traditional law enforcement metrics don't capture this dynamic. When the Coast Guard announces they've seized a submarine worth several $1,000,000 and nearly $250 million in cocaine, it's a legitimate operational success. But if that success triggers the development of 10 alternative smuggling methods, each harder to detect than the original submarine, the actual strategic outcome becomes ambiguous. Law enforcement celebrations, seized drugs, the ocean. The question that strategic planners in the Pentagon and the Treasury Department were quietly asking themselves by 2021 was this. The aggressive anti-submarine operations actually made the situation better or worse? Were we winning a tactical battle while losing a strategic war? The data suggested the latter. Cocaine seizures in the United States actually declined in the years following the major submarine interdiction campaigns. Purity of cocaine available on American streets increased, suggesting that despite lower volumes, product was reaching its destination more efficiently. Street prices for cocaine actually decreased in certain major markets, indicating that supply wasn't being significantly constrained. Declining statistics, data charts, analytics, in other words, all the Coast Guard's increased submarine interdictions weren't reducing the amount of cocaine reaching American consumers. They were just forcing the cartels to use different transportation methods. Methods that, in some ways, were proving more difficult to interdict than submarines had ever been. This brings us back to that fundamental question about the submarine that started all this. Was capturing it actually a victory? In the immediate tactical sense, absolutely. But in the broader strategic context of the war on drugs, the question becomes far more complicated. The captured submarine's crews spent years in prison. The vessel was scrapped, the cocaine was destroyed. But the organization that built it adapted, it evolved, it learned, and it continued operating just in a different way. Prison facility, detention, organization chart. Sometimes the most important victories in warfare are the ones that fundamentally alter how your adversary operates, even if those iterations ultimately make them harder to defeat. The submarine capture did exactly that. It was a perfect tactical success that may have contributed to a strategic disadvantage. That's the hidden cost of asymmetric warfare. It's what the Coast Guard was learning in real time. as they adapted their strategies throughout the 2020s. That's the lesson that extends far beyond just narco submarines. Coast Guard patrol, radar system, military surveillance. End of part 3. Military Command Center, strategic planning, defense analysis. The real story here isn't about catching one submarine or seizing one shipment. It's about the invisible chess match being played across thousands of miles of ocean, where every tactical victory reshapes the entire battlefield. When the Coast Guard successfully interdicted that narco sub in 2019, they didn't just remove drugs from circulation, force the cartels to fundamentally rethink their entire logistics network. And that's exactly what happened. By the early 2020s, the cartels had learned from their losses. They weren't building slower subs anymore. They were building faster ones. They weren't relying on single choke points in the Pacific. They were diversifying routes, some through Central America, some through the Caribbean, some even attempting routes across the Atlantic that nobody was watching closely enough. They were commissioning multiple vessels simultaneously, increasing redundancy so that losing one shipment no longer meant operational failure. Submarine design, engineering blueprint, maritime technology. What the cartels discovered was that the Coast Guard's interdiction strategy, while tactically brilliant, was also informationally loud. Every time they caught a sub, they revealed something about their surveillance capabilities, showed their detection thresholds. They demonstrated their response times. And the cartels, operating with the advantage of distributed learning across multiple organizations, adapted faster than any centralized military bureaucracy could evolve. This is asymmetric warfare in its purest form, not because the cartels had superior firepower, but because they had superior adaptability. Cartel operation, intelligence gathering, maritime planning. The submarines themselves became almost secondary to the real innovation, the intelligence apparatus that surrounded them. Cartels invested heavily in their own surveillance networks. They hired former military and intelligence officers, acquired their own drone technology. They developed counter-surveillance protocols that would rival many small nations, created early warning systems that could detect Coast Guard operations before they even launched. By 2021 and 2022, the interdiction rates had shifted. The Coast Guard's capture statistics, which had peaked around 11 to 15% during the peak submarine era, began declining again as cartels implemented lessons learned from every single bust. The submarine program didn't die. It evolved into something far more sophisticated and far harder to track. Here's where the story takes another turn that most analysts miss entirely. Satellite map, ocean route, time tracking. The very success of narco submarines as a smuggling method created a new vulnerability for the cartels, one that had nothing to do with the Coast Guard at all. As submarine operations grew more sophisticated and more expensive, they became concentrated in the hands of fewer, larger criminal organizations. The barrier to entry increased dramatically. A basic narco sub might cost anywhere from $2 to $5 million. Advanced one could exceed $10 million. That kind of capital requirement meant that only the most established cartels could afford to operate them. Smaller organizations, which had historically been able to compete through sheer numbers and distributed risk, were priced out of the market. They had to rely on surface vessels, which were easier to detect but also easier to defend if you had speed and coordination. They had to use aircraft, which burned through fuel and pilots at unsustainable rates. They had to use land routes, which meant confronting local authorities that weren't as well equipped, but were also far more brutal and unpredictable than the Coast Guard. The submarine program, in other words, had inadvertently centralized the cartel ecosystem itself. Cartel compound security, criminal organization, armed guards. That centralization created new intelligence opportunities. Instead of tracking hundreds of small smuggling operations spread across Central America, US, intelligence agencies could now focus their resources on monitoring a dozen major cartels. Instead of trying to intercept thousands of shipments via hundreds of different methods, they could focus on the organizations that controlled those shipments. It shifted the playing field from logistics interdiction to organizational penetration. And penetration is where intelligence agencies have historically had the most success. The DEA, FBI, CIA all pivoted their strategies accordingly. They increased their focus on human intelligence, recruiting informants within cartel organizations, monitoring communications, tracking financial flows, mapping organizational hierarchies. The technology of interdiction mattered less. The ability to understand and predict cartel behavior mattered far more. By 2023 and into 2024, the submarine program had become almost a curiosity for the cartels. Still operational, still occasionally used for high value shipments, but no longer the dominant smuggling method it once was. The cartels had learned that every innovation they deployed would eventually be countered. Every new technology would eventually be understood. Every new tactic would eventually be defended against. Intelligence analysis, data monitoring, law enforcement office. The real innovation became operational security at the organizational level rather than technological innovation at the equipment level. Hide the organization, compartmentalize the leadership, distribute decision-making across multiple nodes so that losing one node doesn't collapse the entire network. Build redundancy not just in vessels and routes, but in command structures and supply chains. This is the evolution of modern asymmetric conflict that textbooks don't teach yet. This is how non-state actors adapt to state-level surveillance and interdiction. This is how criminal organizations survive